Yes. Okay. Recording started.
Okay, just sharing my screen. Okay, you should all see a slide that says interviewing tips and strategies. If at any time you can't see my slides or me or can't hear me, just speak up, jump on the audio. Actually, let me move the Zoom to my other screen so I can keep an eye on chat. And hopefully you're still seeing the slide. If anybody has questions, either type it in the chat or speak up. And let's get into it. So my name's Mark. I'm an engineer at Google. And what I'd like to do for the next half hour is kind of give you a mini course on interviewing skills. I'll actually do this in about 25 minutes and then try to leave a little bit of time at the end for any questions you might have. My goal today is really to just kind of demystify the process a little bit and to give you some strategies for doing the best that you can with it. Start with a few general tips. The main thing I think is important is we tend to get very nervous in these kind of situations, but remember, it's just an interview. And you're going to have multiple interviews. Your life doesn't depend on the outcome of this interview. So try to relax. I know that's easier said than done, but just try to keep it in the context that this is one of potentially many jobs you're going to apply for. And if this doesn't work out for whatever reason, there'll be other opportunities. Take your time during these interviews. There's no need to rush or feel like you have to rush. It's okay to pause from time to time and just collect your thoughts. There's nothing wrong with that. I would say try to speak in your own authentic voice. Don't try to be someone else, because I think that comes across when you're genuine and being yourself. And I think that helps people get a sense of who you are. Depending on your personality, if you kind of like to joke around a little bit and be on the lighthearted side, I think that's good. I think that helps diffuse some of the tension if you're comfortable going there. And the last thing I would say is approach it as a learning experience. Like, I'm going to have a good experience. I'm going to come away, whether I get the job or not, I'm going to come away with some practice interviewing. So just kind of go into it with the idea that I'm going to have some fun at this interview. I'm going to meet somebody, some nice people, and we'll get some experience. Let me jump into a few sample interview questions just to give you a sense of what kind of questions you'll typically hear in an interview. This is pretty common. Tell me about yourself. I think it's good to have, be ready for that one and have a sort of a story about who you are and what you're interested in, what you're trying to accomplish. I wouldn't rehearse it, word for word, but just have a sense of how you'd like to respond to that kind of question. Why do you want to work here? It's always good to know something about the company. So it's good to research the company, understand what they do, what kinds of work they do that might appeal to you, that might interest you. So again, you have a little bit of a story to tell. When I say tell a story, it should be succinct. You don't want to go on too long, but just being able to say why you think this company makes sense and why you'd like to work there, and to show that you've done a little bit of homework and you know something about the company. What kind of work are you most interested in? Now, this is an interesting one because you can either go too broad or too narrow. If you go really narrow, it can sort of limit your scope. And if you go too broad, it can sound like, well, like if you said, I'm really into computing. Well, what does computing mean? And I kind of recommend a middle of the road approach here, which is to say, pick a branch or two of tech that you're interested in. For example, you might say, I'm really interested in cybersecurity, or I'm really interested in machine learning. Now, granted, those are big areas, but then you can say within those domains, you don't have to say like the thing I want to do is X, because at the age of a student, you don't probably know exactly what sub area you want to work on, and I think that's perfectly fine. But a good thing to say is, so I'm interested in machine learning, and I did some work on a project that did X, that did natural language processing, and I found that really interesting. But I want to learn, more in that area, or in the general machine learning area. So that way, you kind of put a stake in the ground for for a high level area, and you don't pin yourself down, but you share some thoughts about other things things you'd like to do in that broader domain. What sort of experience do you have in that area? This is more for a professional person who's been in the, working for a while. But if you do get a question like this, I think it's it's fine to cite your coursework. So, I had a class on machine learning, and we did this project, and it was really fun. And I left the code on GitHub. If you have a GitHub account, it's nice to leave sort of a trail behind of your work. It's not imperative. So just being able to say some of the things you were exposed to is helpful. Tell me about a project you're proud of. Again, this is maybe more for a professional person, but you can cite a school project or even something extracurricular that you did that you're proud of. And don't forget to say why you're proud of. A lot of candidates tell me about a project and then they don't tell me why it's special to them. Tell me about a challenge you faced and how you overcame it. Again, this could be technical or it could be human interactions. Like I was in a hackathon and we were working on this project, and there was a little bit of friction between two other people, and I felt like we weren't going to get all the stuff done if they weren't able to work together. So I worked with them to try to smooth things over. You kind of get the sense of what I'm saying, just something you bumped into that was a roadblock for you and how you overcame it. And then you'll typically do a coding challenge if you're going for a coding job. And I'm going to focus on that part just because I come from that world. And it's one of the most challenging parts of job interviews, but you may not all face these coding challenges. But you'll also hear at the end any questions for me. This is an interesting one because if you're not ready for it, it can take you by surprise and you can be like, oh my God, what do I want to ask this person? So think ahead of time of some questions to ask. And the reason is it just shows a general sense of curiosity. Like, I want to know about this job. Typical things I'll hear is, what's a day in the life like in your job, a day in your life like? What are some of the best and worst things about working for company X? So anything at all that you're interested in, just make sure you have 2 or 3 in your pocket so that you'll get useful information as well as showing that you really care. Okay, let's look at a coding question. This is something that you might, something just pulling a typical example here out of the air. You might be asked to write a function that accepts a list of elements and returns a list with the same elements in reverse order. So sort of reverse the contents of the list and do it in any programming language you choose. And an example of what I mean is, for example, in Python, you might have a list with this syntax, 1, 2, 3. So a sequence of 3 integers, 1, 2, 3. And your function I would call your function with that list passed as an argument, and your function should return a list with those exact elements in reverse, 3, 2, 1. So here's a sample solution. We're going to kind of jump to the conclusion here and use this as context for some of the pointers that are about to come. So a sample solution might say, I'm going to define a function called reverse, and it's going to take a parameter called li here, which is assumed to be a list. First, I'll initialize a new variable with an empty list, call that the reversed list. And you can probably guess by that name, that's going to hold the reversed version of the past list, of the list that came into the function. Then we're going to iterate over that list, the incoming list, for I in li, for element that's going to successively take the variable I in that list. Insert that element to the front of the list. You may not have seen this syntax before, but insert is a method that you call on a list, and it says insert something into position, insert into position A, something else B. And what I mean here is you pass arguments for the position and the value. And in this case, I'm saying position 0, which means insert that at the front of the list. So each time through the list, we're inserting that element at the front of the list, effectively building up the list backward. And then return that reversed list to the caller. So I want to underscore, that's one way to solve this problem. And in fact, I was able to come up with 5 or 6 ways, and there are probably many more than that. So one thing to take away from this is there's never a right answer, and you don't have to rack your brain to come up with a perfect response. It's more about coming up with something that works and that you understand and are feeling comfortable with. So that takes me to the first of 5 points I want you to think about when you're coding in this kind of environment. One is confirm your understanding. So you haven't written any code yet. I've just specified the problem. And even if you think you know what I want you to do, I want you to confirm that with the interviewer by kind of reading back what you heard. So here's what I think I heard. You want me to do this, you want it to work this way, there's a constraint here, whatever it is you heard, I want you to read that back to the interviewer and make sure that your understanding is correct. And by the way, if you get thrown a problem that you really don't feel sort of equipped to deal with because maybe you haven't covered that topic in class, I think it's perfectly fine to say, this is actually a new concept for me. In this context, for example, you might say, I haven't really learned about Python lists yet. So I'm not fully up to speed for this one, but I'll try my best. And the interviewer might say, well, in a nutshell, a list is this, and might help you out a little bit there. But I guess the key point is that you won't always have learned the building blocks you need to solve a problem, and it's okay to mention that. This confirming of your understanding is really important for 2 reasons. One is obviously to make sure you know what you're trying to solve, you understand the problem fully. But it also shows the interviewer that you're methodical. This is a really strong signal that says, okay, this person wants to really pin down what they need to do before they start doing it. And that's a great thing to show the interviewer. Number 2 is ask questions. So oftentimes the problem will be incomplete, and oftentimes it will be so by design. And the interviewer may be looking for you to flesh out some details that weren't specified. So in the previous step, you understood what the person was saying, but it might have not been complete. So before you jump into the code, ask about what we call edge cases. So these are kind of the funny, odd inputs to your function that might not be something obvious, or you might not have been explicitly told about. So examples of that would be, what happens when you call this function with an empty list? And so this is something you ask the interviewer, and you can couch it like this. I want to make sure that I know all of the behaviors that I want this function to handle. What would you like the function to do when it gets an empty list or a single element list? And they'll probably say something like, just return that. Like an empty list reversed is probably an empty list, but don't assume, ask that. What if I receive a list of lists? Like, do you want me to reverse the lists inside the lists? And hopefully the interviewer is reasonable and will say, no, that's okay, but good idea. I hadn't even thought of that. What if you receive a non-list? Like, what if someone calls the function with an integer? Should you return an error? Should you return the same integer? Ask for clarification there. Okay, so now you've confirmed that you understand the problem. You've asked some clarifying questions, and now it's time to write your code. And the key thing I want you to remember here is to talk while you're coding. And this is a little bit counterintuitive for some folks because they think, well, if I talk, it'll seem like I don't know what I'm doing. Like, shouldn't I just, be like some savant who blasts out a bunch of code on a whiteboard? And no, everybody takes their time, has to think. And when you think out loud, it actually helps because it gives you a way to organize your thoughts. Sorry, I'm blowing through these bullets. Let me take it one step at a time. To see what this talk might look like in the context of this problem, you might say, I know that I need a loop here because I want to do something with each element in a list. I also know that I want a new list so that I can use it to assemble the reversed version of the input list. I guess I could take the input list and reverse it in place, but that's going to get a little more complicated. Let's just do it with a separate list for now. And so let's start writing. Here's defining my function. Here's a for loop so that I can actually, let's initialize my reverse list first. Now let's have a for loop. And so as you're writing the code, you're explaining what's going on in your head. This is really good because it shows the interviewer how you kind of work through the problem, how you approach it. And at the same time, it actually helps you kind of focus your thoughts and organize your thinking. Keep it clear and simple. So don't try to solve Don't go for a really complex solution. Try to keep it as simple as you possibly can. That's another one of those things that's easier said than done. But one trick that I like to use is to start by thinking about the data. What does the data look like? And the reason is that when you have your data well organized and well structured, the code to process the data tends to be a little bit easier. So take a pause up front and think a little bit about what you want the data to look like, the lists in this case, but it might be a different data structure. Try not to get caught in low level details. Sometimes you'll be working on a step in a function and you'll be like, oh, how do I do this? And you'll start to dive down too deeply in that. And it can be distracting to the bigger picture. So just as an example, sometimes I'll see someone wanting to do something like convert an integer to a string, and they can't remember the function. So they'll say, I'm going to write a function to convert an integer to a string. And now they've just taken on a totally different programming problem than the one I gave them, and it's going to affect their ability to complete the first problem. So what I recommend you do in that sort of situation is say, you know what, I know there's a function that I can use to convert an integer to a string, or at least I'm pretty sure there is one, but I can't remember the name of that function. So I'm going to just make believe there is an existing function called int to string. And I think for most interviewers, they'll be fine with that because they don't want to know that you've memorized every function in JavaScript or Python or whatever language. They just want to know that you're aware there's a function like that and you can name it whatever you want for this exercise. And don't optimize or over optimize. Don't try to make your code absolutely perfect. But as you have ideas throughout the process, feel free to mention them, and that fits into the, verbalize what's going on in your head. And the last step is, how do you know your code works? So you finished, you're satisfied with what you've produced. It's not perfect, not expected to be, but you are ready to say, there it is, I'm done. Before you do that, I want you to think about this. How do you know it works? And I want you to verify it verbally again through talking with the interviewer. So here's an example of how I would verbally verify the solution we just looked at. I'd take the basic case or two. So for example, that example I showed you with the 3-element list, I would work through this function. I'd say, okay, I'm going to pass that list to reverse, initialize rev list. For I and li, one after another, I'm going to step through 1, 2, and 3, and I'm going to insert them at the front of rev list. And I might actually, if it's a whiteboard or a document, I might actually write out the variables and their current values with each step, almost like if you've used a debugging program where you can watch the variables change in real time. So I might write rev list equals empty list. And as I walk through the program, I'd change the value of rev list to show 3, and then a 2, and then a 1. And at the end of that, you'll be able to say, yeah, I can see how this would work for that basic case. Let's try it with an edge case now. Same process, but with some different data. If you are working through it, the explanation like this, and you see a problem, go ahead and mention it. I don't think this is going to quite work in this case. That alone, for me at least, you get credit for spotting. So bring it up. Don't be afraid like, oh my God, there's a bug, I better not talk about it. It's perfectly fine because the interviewer may very well see it as well, and you identifying it is helpful. If you can fix it easily, you know what? I just need to move this, change this I to a J and everything's perfect, do it. If it's a little bit more involved and you don't want to necessarily go there, I think it's okay to say, I think I would fix it by redoing this loop, or saying, you can say something a little bit vague. And the interviewer may push a little bit like, can you show me how to fix it? But the key here is just showing that you spot the problem and have some rough idea at least of how you might go about repairing it. So I've come up with this hopefully catchy, pun intended, acronym that may make this easier for you to remember, but to review, confirm your understanding, ask some questions, and then when you start coding, talk about what you're doing, keep it clear and simple, and make sure to remember to demonstrate how you know your code works at the end. One bit to think about that's a little bit more advanced, and I don't think necessarily everyone needs to deal with this one, but it's just kind of one of those things that might take you a little bit step further, and that's to think about how your program might scale. And what do I mean about scale? Well, imagine I gave you the same problem only in a much bigger context. So instead of a Instead of a list with 3 or 4 elements, imagine if I gave you a list with 1 billion or 1 trillion elements. Would the same code work, and how would it work? So this is just restating what I just said. You don't have to be able to solve this and demonstrate how it would work on a broader scale, but just be able to speak about what might go wrong and perhaps how you might scale your solution, but you can do it in high level terms. For example, if I asked you to do this for a list with 1 trillion elements, you might say to yourself, you know, that's probably going to take a long time to reverse with this algorithm. So now you've identified what might not work or what might be a problem. And one way to improve it would be to do parallel processing, whether it's parallel functions running at the same time on one computer, or even having multiple computers together. Now you've said at a high level, without writing any code or anything, how you might scale and get around this problem that you identified. Again, this is more advanced stuff. You may not have, this might be, you may not have had the foundation to fully embrace this part, but I'm just giving this to you for down the road, or if you're interested in considering this. There's a link here. There's supposed to be, there it is. Okay. There's a link here to a sample interview on YouTube. This is produced by Google, and I think it's a really nice educational tool. It's a little bit advanced again. I think you're mostly freshman and sophomore, if I understand correctly. And this is more of a professional interview, but I think there's a lot of tips in watching. So don't get too caught up in the specific problem or algorithm they're working on, as much as the interplay between the interviewer and the interviewee, to get a good sense of the kind of back and forth that might be helpful. One other thing I wanted to share is people tend to think of software engineers as the only, and I see Angelica asked about a link to my slides, which I'll put in the chat in a second. People tend to think of software engineers as, you know, the ultimate or the only role in tech companies. And there are so many different ways you can contribute to a tech company's business that I wanted you to be aware of some of those roles. And so what I've assembled here is, somebody tell me if that link doesn't work that I put in the chat. Oh, the link to the interview. Okay, it's in the link to, if you click on the link to the slides, you'll get the link to the interview. So yeah, what's on this slide is a link to a bunch of short YouTube videos that explain what those roles are like. Just as an example, if you're interested in, you know, what would a UX designer do? You can click on that, and you will get a day in the life of a UX designer at Google video. So I encourage you to take a look at these and just kind of follow your nose and see if there's any career paths here that might interest you. And it might open your eyes to some different courses to take or something like that. That's actually all I had for you today. And I think I'm just on the nose of almost 25 minutes. So I have a little bit more time here in case anybody has any questions. Feel free to jump on the mic or chat if you prefer.
Tyler has his hand raised. Tyler, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. For the coding questions, how long would we get to answer that? Just like a rough guesstimate for ballpark.
Yeah, it usually varies, but oftentimes in my experience, I have about an hour, 45 minutes or an hour. Usually lately it's been an hour, and I would normally devote about 20 minutes, maybe a third of the time for the coding exercise.
All right, thank you. And I also would,
I was just going to say, you might want to ask Alex that as well, because he'll probably have some experience.
Generally, I'll jump in. Your intern interviews will be 45 minutes, of which Marc's about right there. 20, 25 minutes I spent coding, and the other 15, 20 minutes. Usually it's like, you'll have a 5-minute intro at the beginning where I'll tell you about myself. I'll ask you to tell me about yourself. I'll spend a couple minutes explaining the problem to you. Then we'll code for 20, 25 minutes. And at the end, there's a couple minutes for questions for you to ask me. That's the general 45-minute structure for the intern interviews.
Okay, thank you. And I also wanted to ask, for coding questions, should we be doing comments as we go in addition to talking to them out loud? Or do you think that just takes away from our time to work?
When you say comments, do you mean verbal comments or code comments?
Comments within the code.
Okay. So I think showing comments in the code is great, actually, because it shows that you're aware of the value of comments. I would be pretty terse, just so, like you said, it doesn't distract you too much. I wouldn't write like multi-line comments with deep insights about what you're doing, but just a little bit here and there is helpful. The other place where I love comments is sometimes you want to validate the input. And if you remember the point about not going down into a rabbit hole, validating input can get you off to like writing a lot of code that's not central to the problem. So sometimes I like when people just write a comment that says, need to check input or need to make sure this is a non-empty list or whatever it is. And then you can come back to that verification step. But that's just one example of a way that a comment can help. But in general, yeah, I think putting comments in the code to a limited extent is nice to see.
And
Thank you very much.
I'll jump in, Tyler, and say that the direction of your question is great. You're totally right. We do care about style when we're interviewing you because you are reading your own code. You have to read your own code. We have to read your code. If you get hired to the company, someone else has to read your code. And so the idea of thinking about style is great. In fact, that's something that we explicitly look for. And that isn't just comments, but it has to be like your variable names. Don't just pick a random letter like Q for your variable name. Like come up with a name that actually represents what you're doing. All the stuff that we've been learning about style in this class, if you keep applying it, is great. I see there are other questions. Real quick, Yinka, I saw you had your hand up earlier. Did you have the same question? Do you still have a question?
Yeah, I had the same question. It's answered now.
Okay, cool. Angelica?
Yes, so yesterday I did a practice interview with Carrot, and the first two questions was good, I knew what to do, but the last question I had absolutely no idea what to do. So what if we get a question that we have absolutely no idea what to do? How do we go about maneuvering through it?
Mark, can I take the first stab
Sure.
and then let you give the general answer? I'm going to give you, Angelica, a step-specific answer. For step, you are expected to know the answers for stuff that you've learned, but for the step interview specifically, you're allowed to tell your interviewer, hey, we actually haven't covered this in the class that I've taken, because you're only expected to have taken one CS class by the time you interview. So for step specifically for you, if you go and interview for step, you can say, hey, we didn't talk about bit operations, so I don't know about this. And the interviewer, I think, either gives you another question or like explains whatever you need to know. But Mark, maybe you have a general answer, because after step, after your freshman interviews, you can't really say that anymore. You're expected to know the stuff that you're being asked. So Mark, what would you do?
Was it a coding question, Angelica, or more of like
it was a coding question. It
and
was about
was it
graphs and maps.
okay? And was it something that you just hadn't seen before, or an algorithm you hadn't
Yeah,
heard of before?
I didn't see it before. I could try to figure out what to do, so I tried to figure out what to do with dictionaries, by using dictionaries, but like how he wanted it to get done, I didn't know how to do it.
Yeah, a lot of times people get stuck with terminology, right? So a map in C++ or in Java, actually, there's called something else in Java, but those are equivalent to dictionaries in Python, as you figured out. So sometimes it's a question of just saying, I'm not familiar with this term or that term. I don't know what a graph is. Can you briefly explain to me so partly I think you can try to pull things out of the interviewer, but at some point I think it's perfectly fine, as Alex said, to say, I haven't studied graphs and I really don't know how to do a depth first search. Now that you've explained what a graph is, I could imagine that you'd want to come up with some code that, visits the different nodes in the graph in some order. And there's probably an algorithm to decide how to travel through the graph, but having not studied it, I'm not sure. I don't think I really have too much to add beyond what Alex said, but I think just asking more questions to make sure you understand it. And as I think even beyond student level interviewing, personally, I think it's okay to say I'm not familiar with that concept or I haven't learned that. But be open to trying. If you want me to try, I'll take a shot at it. I think it's fine.
I'll say, Angelica, that a lot of times the interviewer, we like when I'm interviewing people, when Mark interviews people, we really want our candidates to succeed. Like we want you to do well. And so kind of we want to give you hints also, like when you're stuck. This is part of the reason why it's so important to talk out loud as you're going. If you're just stuck in your head and you don't want to say it, like we have no way of helping you. But if you talk out loud and we can tell where you're stuck, we can give you a little hint in the right direction of like, hey, what if you tried doing this with the dictionary? And that might make something click in your mind and you're like, oh, okay, I'll go down this direction, which you didn't really understand in the beginning. So talking out loud and being clear about where your mind is at can help us help you.
Okay, I have a follow-up question if you guys don't mind.
No,
What if you get the question wrong? Will that like stop you from getting that particular internship or job?
I wouldn't say it necessarily rules you out. And the reason is twofold. One, the first reason is that wrong is a subjective term,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
how wrong was it would be my question. Like, did I ask you to do something in Python and you did it in Java? Okay, that's a little bit wrong. But it might be that you kind of got the gist of the problem and I liked how you talked through it, and the code just didn't work for a reason you missed. To me, that's not as wrong as some other scenarios. The other reason is that even if it is quote unquote wrong, there's a lot of elements that go into an interview and the coding part is just one piece of that. And so
Right.
you may do, yeah. So your assessment will be some sort of a function of all other things you've done, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Ashley?
I had a question about how, like, I know for me, like, I tend to get nervous really easily when it comes to like interviews because I've done interviews in the past, not related to coding, but just other things. Is there a way to be in like the right headspace going into these coding interviews?
Is there a way that you can say the last part again?
Like, be in the right headspace, like, be positive and not be so nervous?
Yeah. That's a really good question because it's a natural stress-inducing situation for everyone. So the first thing is you're not alone. I used to get really nervous for interviews, and I think most people do. There's lots of different ways to sort of relax yourself. Some people like to do meditation. Some people sort of have rituals where they do like little exercise routines before something that's a little nerve-wracking, like giving a talk. That's like a very personal thing, and I would sort of do some research maybe on that to see what works best for you. But the key thing I think to keep in mind is to tell yourself this is just an interview. This is not, no one's going to get hurt. No one's going to, this could go completely horrible and no one's going to die. No one's going to get hurt. The worst that can possibly happen is you're not going to get this job. And then there'll be another interview and you'll do better. So I would just try to sort of reassure yourself that, it's just, like I said, it's just an interview. And there was one other thing I wanted to say. Oh yeah, every interview is practice, right? So even a bad interview is helpful because you're going to learn a lot and you're going to remember it for the future. So it's actually not terrible because you're going to be a better interviewer after that experience.
Okay, thank you.
I'll add on a fun fact. I'm here at Google now. I interviewed at, I think, 13 or 14 different companies and got rejected from all of them before I got my first internship. And yeah, I know, right? It was demoralizing. I found the best thing that would help me not get nervous by the end of it was just having done enough practice, or like having done them enough. Like the more you do them, the more comfortable you are that you can handle. Because it's scary. You get asked something. It's kind of like teaching, right? When I'm teaching, you guys can ask me anything in the world in class, and I have to be able to kind of handle it somehow. So that's scary too. in the same way it's the interviews, you come in and you could be asked anything and you want to have an answer. And so just going through the experience of interviewing enough times, and you might say, hey, well, I don't want to get rejected 13 times like Alex did before I get my first internship. That's why we have these mock interviews for you, where you can sign up for a mock interview with a Googler or through Carrot and get that like first nervous energy. Just get the experience of being asked questions on the spot that you don't know the answer to. Get used to that feeling. So mock interviews help a lot.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I see Dagmawi has a question in chat, which is a good question. Considering leak code difficulty, should we be solving easier and medium level problems? That's kind of hard to answer. It depends. Probably in this class, kind of the easier level questions. But I will say that one thing that I find is a common misconception is people think, I need to solve a bunch of leak code problems, and that's what's going to get me ready for the interview. Really, in the interviews, we're looking for how you think through a problem and talk about trade-offs and make your decisions. And so it's not just sit there silently until the test cases pass. It's more about how do I solve something in collaboration with someone else and show my thinking. And so I just want to say, to make sure that you kind of reframe that a little bit as you're doing these problems, whether they're the easy ones or the medium ones. If you're preparing for interviews, you should be doing them while talking out loud and explaining why you're making the decisions that you're making. I'm going to use a dictionary because I want to map some key to some value rather than a list. Or as you get more experience, I want to use a set, or I'm going to use a list because it has constant lookup time or a hash map. These things that you're going to learn about later, why you're using them is really important.
Absolutely.
And I see, I'll just repeat Richard's comment here. Richard is one of the TAs. I didn't do any mock interviews. I used my real interviews with companies as my mocks and failed everything. Same, Richard, me too. Never landed an internship and rejected ever like Alex. Yes, me too. Finally, after I had practice, I aced my Google interviews. Yes, me too. My Google was my first internship, but it was after getting rejected from a bunch of places.
Yeah, like everything else in life, practice will get you much further than if you just kind of jump in without preparing.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, does anyone have any last minute questions? Yeah, okay, thanks. I think we can all give Marc a round of applause, virtual round of applause. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Alex. And it was a pleasure being here with you today. And I hope to come back and help you with some other talks or topics or whatever. But otherwise, have a great weekend. Take care, everyone.